Hello, Wrecker.
Hey Nick, how you doing?
Good. Hey, last night I was up late and working
Drinking
on a
whiskey.
revision. Drinking was actually I was drinking wine yesterday, not whiskey. It was a beautiful Barbaresco in Italian. It was delicious. But no, I'm drinking my Barbaresco and I'm working on this revision. And a big thing that the review panel was pushing was implications for practice. It's like, all right, this is a nice article, whatever. We like your rigor, we like this, and it's a couple rounds into it, and they're like, yeah, but why does this matter for practice? And what does this matter for practice? And of course, me as an author, I get it, sorta, but I'm frustrated because I'm like, you know why, right? It matters for practice. Now leave me alone, right? So that's what I was struggling with yesterday. I think it's very timely that the world famous Michael Rosemann is here to join us this morning or this afternoon or
Actually, this evening, yeah.
yeah, it's morning for me. You got me out of bed early. So Michael, welcome.
Welcome to both of you, Nick and Jan. Lovely to see you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you here in your world famous podcast.
Well, it's actually good. We're not sure about the word famous, but it's actually good to get someone from Australia here. I feel like I've been talking about the Australian system and sort of the way things used to be anyway while I was there. And we never actually talked to anyone from region 3, right? From that region. So it's good to have you. I know it's late at night for you. It's perfect midday for me and really early morning for Nick after an evening with red wine.
So what's cool? So two things about Michael. One is Michael's not actually Australian. You cheated us, right? He's actually a German. He's one of those German Australians like you, right?
Yeah.
Who went down under. But the other thing, and I think it's really timely, is you talk about implications for practice. I mean, you look at Michael's CV and yeah, a lot of scholarship and a lot of things that are really, one would argue highly scholarly, but man, so many kind of relevant practical guidelines. I'm looking at your Google Scholar site right now, a handbook, a guidelines. You've got even a German and in Wirtschaftsinformatik, you have something called process management, all one word, which sounds it sounds like an implication for practice itself, right? How do practitioners use conceptual modeling in practice? So on and so forth. So you are the poster child for implications for practice, right, Michael? I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Should everything we do have implications for practice?
So I wish I would still be a child, Nick. So I think it would be nice if we see more impact, but of course, not everything needs to have an implication for practice. And implications to practice are not a kind of 1-0 variable. Some are very close to practice, others are further removed. And we stand on each other's shoulders. And some people are closer to practice than others. I can see that maybe information systems, unlike other disciplines, has less of a call for core foundational research. And that in natural science and other areas, the call for practice is maybe less noisy, less loud than our discipline, no doubt.
So that's the argument that we are in an applied science, so we better be relevant, because we are not a foundational theoretical science, and we're also not the humanities. We should matter, and we do matter, and hence we should be relevant. Everything that we do should be relevant.
What do you mean by relevant, though?
Yeah, I mean, relevance means of potential interest, of potential impact, worthwhile to be considered. And relevant could be today, it could be in 10 years. But I think we need a practitioner's lens when we publish. And I think a good scholar doesn't live in isolation. A good scholar understands there are multiple audiences. And they are to translate your outcomes into communities that go far beyond your immediate academic neighborhood, I think is an obligation we have.
But here's the issue that I have with that when it comes to the implications for practice section in a paper. Now, Michael, like we've worked together for God knows, like a decade or something, and we did engage and we did translate. But none of that had anything to do with that section 5.3 in the paper, this implications for practice part of an article that would end up in an IS journal. And we did other things. We did regular roundtables. We went to, vendor conferences. We did executive teaching. We did a lot of things to translate, I suppose, what we knew or what we thought or what our ideas were to practice. None of that involved a written thing that was a subsection of an academic article. So I think whenever people equate relevance with we need implications for practice section, I think that's just bullshit. I think it's a horrible way of translation. It's completely, it still speaks to us. I mean, we're writing this, so Nick writes the section and I'm going to read it. The CIO is not going to read that. I'm reading this, and then I can think, well, Nick is a really relevant guy because he has an implications for practice section, and I'm happy to agree with the point he makes there. But who cares? It's the wrong audience.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between am I relevant in the paper that I write, or am I a relevant researcher, a relevant scholar? And I understand when it comes to the last pages of a paper that I talk about future research or implications for practice. That's one statement. The question is, when I finish this paper and I have a chance to articulate my ideas to professional practice, what do I say? What can I say and make an effort? Let me give you an example. When I go to a conference and someone presents a case-based piece of research, and I tend to ask them, did you go back to the organization you work with and did you present your findings? And more often than not, the answer is no. And so that's what I mean. So you can present a paper to the academic audience, but then do you take step 2 and ensure that your research, where possible, is heard, is understood, and has potential for impact? So talking about, is it relevant paper or is it a relevant scholar? Might be 2 different topics.
Well, so I remember talking to a rather senior person. I'm not going to mention her because she's, this is her story, not mine. But she told me she was talking once to kind of someone who did a bit of an econometric analysis on pricing of airline tickets, right? And they did maybe a conference presentation or something, and the person, said, well, this is how they price, and this is how they do it, and this is how it could be optimized to better price. And afterwards, she asked the question, hey, so how did you figure out that this is how airlines price their tickets? I mean, that was pretty, did you talk to many? Don't they do it differently? And then the presenter said, well, I don't know. I've never talked to anybody at an airline, right? Yeah, they were inferring how they price from their, they could have easily, or not easily, but they could have conceivably called up the airlines and figure, all right, how do you price? And then come from that. So there is this problem when you're totally disengaged with the real world, then you're creating puzzles that may or may not exist in the real world. And then you're just doing, it's like the William James came across people arguing over how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin, right? Well, how many angels can you, that's philosophical nonsense, right? So he came across these theologian philosophers asking that. So that's what we end up doing. We end up having these little, nitpicking about human agency, and is agency actually this or is it that? And no one cares because it has no bearing whatsoever on practice, right? So I think having this idea, we're an information systems field, we're talking about technologies out in the world with people and organizations. So maybe we should be out in the world with people and organizations, make sure what we're doing has some validity out there, right?
Well, I think so, but so I agree with this. But at the same time, not every research has to be relevant. So I have no problem with people sitting down and discussing how many angels can fit onto that pen thing. Like, no worries. What I have an issue with is that
you don't have a problem. Wait, hold on, stop. You don't have a problem with that?
Why not? No.
Well, all right. If they're sitting around drinking beer or having coffee and talking about how many angels are on the head of a pin, then I agree with you. I don't have a problem with that. But if that's taking good journal space away from maybe something decent, do we want that in our journals? Do we want to publish this? Do we want to waste
this is
our time
a funny
doing
argument.
Research into this?
On the one hand, you're saying, let it be a marketplace of idea and let be pluralism and everything goes. Well, if everything goes, then everything should be okay. Yeah, you can't just say, look, we want pluralism is fine, but it has to be relevant. Pluralism is fine, but you have to have theoretical contributions and you have to have practical implications. My
Well,
argument
all right,
is
so-
like, well, if we accept one thing, which we should, then we should also accept the other thing and not equate the two things and say everything has to be practical and everything has to be theoretical as well.
First of all, everything doesn't go, Brecker, right? Think about it for a second. We don't want shitty work in the name of pluralism, right? We don't want non-rigorous work necessarily. We don't want uninteresting work. We don't want, there's a lot of things that we don't want published in journals. So pluralism is within certain bounds of a certain rigor, and I would argue relevance, and a certain, there are certain, there's a channel within which we accept pluralism.
Okay, let me move away from this black and white argument. So very concrete. I was reviewing a paper the other week, and it was about affordances, which is theory. And it basically argued that from a particular philosophical perspective, there's something wrong with the way we use it, and we should really be a little bit more commensurate with this other philosophical tradition. So I think that's fine. I don't think that's relevant. It's not. I can't take that to the CIO and say like, change your strategy now. But I think it's fine. However, does it mean that paper also has to have a practical implication section? Because I think, number one, if that's done well and rigorous, why not publish it? And secondly, no, I wouldn't ask this person to write a practical implication section.
I think it's important to have some consciousness, so that I, as an author, understand how far am I removed from impact. And Jan, we also worked on ontological discussions where sometimes you have a healthy distance to the day-to-day life of a process analyst, for example. But it would be good that for me, a scholar is very much aware of where he or she stands. And if we take it to other disciplines, let's say the medical field, there's a reasonably well-defined translational process that we don't have in information systems, but most actors know where in this translational process they are. And that consciousness, I don't think we have it to the same extent in our field.
So, Michael, several episodes back, I'm not sure whether you listened to this one in particular, but we talked with Kalle Lüttin and Ron Weber, and we talked a little bit about the old days. And one of the questions I threw at them was whether some of the wars and the debates that we had at the time, whether they're passé. And my argument was, well, we solved them. Qualitative versus quantitative, well, both is fine. And one of the other things, I think, rigor versus relevance, which you remember because, you wrote one of the big pieces on that topic 20 years ago. But that debate is over. And I think there, relevance is lost. Has it not? I mean, we don't talk about relevance anymore. We don't actually talk about the practical implication sections. Nick, it's funny that you mentioned that your reviewers asked for this. In my papers over the recent years, no one has asked for a practical implication section. I remember they doing so 10 years ago, but it feels like now no one cares anymore.
I think this discussion has become more sophisticated. So we might not question relevance anymore. We might not question the default chapter called Impact for Practice, but I think we are still a long way away from understanding how this one-pager impact for practice turns into reality. And what I said earlier, I think the sort of the call for translational process for information systems that translates where relevant and economically useful such a paper into real-world impact, I think is more urgent than ever. And COVID, other conversations have shown us that I think the appreciation for science has increased dramatically, and that's a unique opportunity for information systems. So while yes, I think information systems is understood as being relevant, but how to really create impact and relevance is sort of a potential, not actual impact. And how do I move from relevance as a potential to actual, tangible, on the street impact is a process I don't think we have well enough understood and executed in IAS.
Yeah. So, and I'll disagree with you a little bit, Recker. I think Andrew is pushing for relevance. I think that there's this Arun Rai, work on important problems editorial he had a few years ago. And I think some of the editorial teams have picked that up and they're beating on authors with it, saying, it's not the streetlight effect where you were looking for the keys where there's a light. Do you remember what he calls this, where it's like some sort of effect where you're asking the wrong question? Oh, type 3.
Type 3 error, yeah. You're working on problems that are not relevant or not important.
Yeah, working on problems that are unimportant and trivial and nothing, right? So I think that's where we're getting the relevance debate. That's its current manifestation, is work on something important. don't do A/B tests on a website, right? Industry's already doing that. Go do something that is meaningful to the world. And if you're publishing something in our journal, make sure it's meaningful. No type 3 errors. So I think a lot of that is actually happening right now. That whole idea of your problem's fine, but which I kind of like. I think we should beat people up on if you're doing so, but I also think that there are certain segments in our field that are more open to. So for example, this paper is about system development. And I think the system development people tend to be closer to practice. Oftentimes they're system developers and they want it to be really super relevant and they want to beat you up for it. Meanwhile, maybe the social theoretic folks are a little further from, they're interested in maybe practices, organizational practices and empirical space, but they'll play with conceptual stuff that maybe has no direct bearing on practice a little bit more, right? So I think it depends on the group you're talking to and everything. But what I'm hearing from you guys is, and it's kind of like Michael, you wrote a paper with Iris Vesey, right? Back in 2008 in MIS Quarterly. And you have this idea, which I think is really the way I think about it. And you have a figure 3, where you kind of talk about a research life cycle, then you apply it, then another research cycle. And this sounds to me like what you guys are saying, that any particular paper you write doesn't necessarily have to be that relevant, but this research trajectory probably should. And you should test what you're doing occasionally with the field. And maybe your MISQ paper doesn't have to be that directly relevant, but along the process, you should knock out a MIS Quarterly executive paper or a magazine article or a case study or something that is directly relevant to practice or education, right? Is this kind of the way you guys are solving this problem?
We have to differentiate, I think, between you as an individual and the ecosystem. So again, if I go back to other fields where someone has a certain idea, but they might not be the ones who take step 2. And we as an ecosystem, we don't think in value chains. We think about the individual that can find the right question, conduct the right research, publish this in the MISQ, but then also to industry. And I think that's sometimes unrealistic. And let's think about IS as a relevant discipline that understood how we curate this sort of process. So while it would be nice that all scholars maybe have an understanding for relevance, that's probably not realistic. Yeah. Let's say take big models like the technology acceptance model. Love it or hate it, but nobody took step 2 and brought it closer to practice. Crafted a tool and implementation if it's so widely cited. And I think we need, as I said, that sort of process where great papers should attract the next entrepreneur who stands on their shoulders and say, I take step 2, I take step 3. But we don't have that mechanism for it.
The textbook authors do, right? I think we have a lot of IS textbooks over the years, and don't they do that? So I think we have it from education, but maybe we don't have it from like HBR articles or something.
Yeah, but then also education. In education, I can teach you one thing. The question is, does it really lead to a tangible, consumable, usable artifact? And I mean, textbook helped me a little bit, but as I said, the medical invention that leads to a medical device that is tested and prototype and goes to rigorous testing and funding and scalable production, we don't have a process like this.
But we do have artifacts like this. I mean, the one thing that comes to my mind are sort of maturity assessment models, these sorts of things, right? So they are sort of the outcome of a scientific process. There's a bunch of methods going to this. There's usually some theory behind it, etc. And that is usually one thing that you can literally take to an organization saying, let's have a look whether you're level 2 or 3. And, if you're level 2, what 5 things you need to do to get to level 3? I mean, there are certain, I guess, science artifacts that are a little bit closer to this. With this maturity example, I always think like, then you have the scholarly, the theoretical guys, and they look down upon the maturity artifacts because it's a weak form of theorizing or something, right? But it's funny because that is an artifact that we could produce all the time. Yeah. But again, how many of them do we really have? Nick, you said how many textbooks do we have? Well, we don't have a lot, and we're getting less and less.
Well, but you're talking about maturity, the big issue. And this is from the other project we're working on. There's a bunch of maturity models out there. they're usually not based in research, right? They're usually some consultant selling it, and then they'll create, and they're reasonable enough, but they're not necessarily steeped in a decade-old research tradition, including the one from Carnegie Mellon, the software.
Well, I mean, which is why you could say, look, there would be a value proposition of doing this research scientifically or whatever better than the consultancy models. Or, of course, you could say, well, they're just good enough. There's no need to do more research on this because what we have is good enough.
But again, can I just back the maturity model? I mean, we, as you know, Jan, developed a maturity model ourselves, a BPM maturity model. But again, we and nobody else, I think, took step 2, said, can I implement this model? Can I make the measurement easier? Can I craft a global benchmarking tool? Can I craft version 1.2 and 1.3? Yes, we have a paper and that's widely cited, and the PhD student got an award. But more or less, that's it. Another researcher is taking it. But right now, you can't download the $9 app and do the maturity assessment on your iPad, and it doesn't come as part of BPM software solution. So that's what I mean with the next step, that just make consumption and appreciation practice a bit easier.
Yeah. All right. So I get it. And I like that because it's the bricks edifice metaphor that we talked about actually in the last episode, Recker, where each contribution doesn't have to be the whole edifice. It's just a brick. And you can count on your ecosystem to maybe form the other bricks. And then you get this edifice of knowledge that includes both deep research and maybe some applied work. It could be tools, it could be articles, right?
And if you think about Will van der Aals, who we had here, and his idea about process mining, I mean, that has led to hundreds of papers, but several of his doctoral students are now unicorns. Yeah, so there were some guys that in the BPM spaces, especially Signavio, Camunda, Celonis, these are now the biggest startups here in Europe, and they're all actually IS PhD students or master students anyway, and then literally built that artifact, Michael, that you were talking about. Is that what you had in mind?
Well, but wait, before you, the point is this: those are entrepreneurs. They build software. And then there are consultants coming up with maturity models, right? Where you're 1.0 and you're 2.0. That's consulting. I did both consulting and entrepreneurship. And those are much different activities than academic research. Academic research is not supposed to be consulting or entrepreneurship, because if it was, it would be consulting or entrepreneurship. And this is my number one problem with the whole relevance for practice issue with research. Is that for the most part, when I work with practice, and I consult to this day, right? They don't need the cutting edge. Occasionally, it's the cutting edge of my research, but usually it's good project management. It's good process management. I mean, I have a friend at Electronic Arts who was in Australia with Stefan Zeidel and the two of you 20 years ago, and he learned BPMN, the notation for business process modeling, all right, which was what, 2005 or something that came out. So he learned that in Australia with you guys. He's now at a video game company. He's a manager. He's an executive. He literally still teaches people business process management notation and how to logically think through their processes that way. And that is remarkable because no one in the video game industry has ever done this. That keeps being relevant for practice in this video game. You guys disseminated it. What you did is working. He doesn't need to write papers in order to get people up to 2005. Right? That this whole idea of that our cutting edge of research has to now be directly, I far prefer Michael's idea of it's an ecosystem. These are all bricks in the edifice of our knowledge. And any one brick may sometime in the future support some activity, but it doesn't have to right now necessarily.
Absolutely. And then some people, I think, Will van der Aals, or like my academic grandfather, August Wilhelm Scheer, who invented ARIS.
He's your grandfather?
Well, yeah, that's right. He's my academic grandfather.
That's awesome. Yeah, he's I remember ARIS in the late 90s. Everyone doing ERP was implementing ARIS. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, but they built their own team of professionals and tradies who helped them to build that house. So he crafted his own company. He wrote the big paper, the big book, but then he had an ecosystem that ensured that this sort of design led to a house that people could live in.
He was a consultant, though, more.
Well, he was also a well-articulated professor, and people like Kretschmer, Jörg Becker wrote his PhD. So he was also a very, very gifted PhD supervisor.
Mhm.
He just had the academic talent and the foresight to build the infrastructure around him that helped to create the impact and the commercial benefits. While most of us are individuals, we throw a paper over the fence, hoping that someone pick it up.
Well, and that's where our Senate incentives are. His
Yes.
incentive in Germany was to build his empire, the Herr Doctor Professor empire. He has a ton of PhD students. He's got a bunch, and they work really closely with industry. And so for him, writing papers was nice, but there was no top tier journal that he was chasing, and there wasn't anybody counting over his shoulder how many hits he gets. I think a lot of junior and mid-career people now, especially at research schools, it's all about counting the top tier publications, and you don't have the army of students working under you, as you said, you're individuals, and you don't. So to become a Scheer or a van der Aalst is much more difficult nowadays. No,
yeah. I mean, I think that the system is stacked against you, certainly, but also I wanted to throw another one. Another problem, I suppose, or at least a challenge. Michael, when you did training, what I really remember to this day, you always said, we don't compromise on rigor. We look for relevance, but we never compromise on rigor. That's sort of one of the guiding motives. But it's actually really hard to do. Yeah, that means we went out and we talked with all these organizations and asked them about their problems. But as Nick said, not all of them were sort of theoretically interesting and so forth. So it was a really delicate ask to find something that, number one, was relevant to begin with. Secondly, which was scholarly interesting, based on our judgment call. And then thirdly, which we could actually then solve using acceptable standards for rigor. That's the third issue. And all of these three things are not easy to do. Finding a relevant problem, connecting to scholarly conversation, and then upholding your standards of rigor. Boy, that's like a really tough filter to go through. And there's very little things that come through. And the fourth issue there is, of course, every now and then you find problems that are interesting or relevant that you could do rigorously, but I can't. Then you very quickly get into areas where, well, that has nothing to do with IS, or, I simply cannot do this. When we were working with Woolworth, we did these studies on bakeries. Well, that was sort of partially organizational behavior, sociology, whatever it was, leadership. There was no system there. I was feeling a lot out of place, to be honest, right? It was very far away from my own comfort zone into the literature that I knew, the methods that I knew, and so forth, right? So it is also difficult, I suppose, to sort of do all these things and be rigorous and relevant and hit the top journals and everything at the same time.
I agree. I mean, compromising is easier than non-compromising. What we should, of course, ask is rigor should be the trade skills we have as a researcher. So we were trained to be rigorous in our field, but I think relevance is the sort of source of delight, the source of differentiation. And you might study your papers and you look for a mechanical or scientific flaw in the conduct of the research. And if this happens, then you didn't execute it as well as you should as a researcher. But if you then can create impact, and I believe this will increase in value, then you really stand out from the pack. And the other one is, and Nick, you talked about where the problem is. We need to be careful that we don't talk about the last page on our paper. Why does this paper matter? We need to talk about the first page of the paper. Where does the problem come from? And move this dialogue towards finding the right problem. And often our training, we teach finding answers, but we don't teach well enough how to find questions. And those, I mean, like you at Woolworths, those who engage with industry, they have an oversupply of problems. They have an oversupply of research questions. And when you have an oversupply of research questions, then you have a positive problem. And again, that creates a competitive advantage for you as an IS researcher.
Well, yes, but there's this issue of the oversupply of problems. And I always run, as you mentioned, Recker, we're trained in our methods, we're trained in our approach, right? We can't do everything, Michael, as you're saying. We go to a company, they're like, we're doing this digital transformation. How can you help us? Ooh, digital transformation, that's new, right? Except for the fact that we've been studying organizational transformation for decades and decades, and we know some things. So now what the poor researcher has to go do is learn about organizational transformation, IT-driven change, just organizational change in general, how you get people, because oftentimes when I work with practice, culture is one of the biggest things they want to change. And it's like, all right, cultural change. Well, we have decades and decades of that. So now I need to actually read everything to figure out what we actually don't know about what, and that whole idea of reading everything when there's that much, that's way too big, right? So we end up having to get into some small little hair splitting element of the digital transformation. And then when we get to that small little hair splitting element, it starts, we're no longer impacting Woolworth or the company doing a digital transformation. Now we're getting into some little niche, because if we really wanted to impact Woolworth, we'd be a consulting organization, and we would go back and look at our change models, and we would bring our army of consultants out and do all of that, right? So there is an issue with it. It's hard. It's very difficult to stay really relevant for practice with every new finding and new research, right? So
of course, engaged scholarship is harder than, let's say, non-engaged, because you've got more variables, you've got more stakeholders, you've got a different pace. Our Woolworths executives, at some point, some of them lost their job or they moved on, and you build again new relationships. So it's time consuming. Jan traveled very often from Brisbane to Sydney. So this is all the contribution of time that those who sit behind the desk and study secondary data don't have, of course.
Yeah. Hey, can I get Wrecker? I wanted to bring this to something that's probably close to you. And that's that, all right, if we take Michael's idea, and it's like, not every article has to have everything, but, as an ecosystem, we should probably be paying attention a little bit more to practice. I think of the two outlets that are just our article, right? There are others like Sloan Management Review, HBR, California Management Review. You and I did something together in one of those in CMR not that long ago. We have, I would say, CAIS, the communications of the AIS, and you were editor-in-chief of that. And then we have MISQ Executive, right? And that's the two most relevant for practice outlets, but there are some others, of course, but those are really close to, I think, the center of the field. I have two gripes with those. Number one, do practitioners ever read them? I think they might find them online, and maybe they do. I have something on chief digital officers that I've actually had practitioners mention to me, like on LinkedIn or whatever. But if so, don't we want to make those more magazine looking? Right now, they're not. They're like academic e-journal. And shouldn't we invest and create a website and make them like communications of the ACM or something?
See, well, I agree on the second part. So should our magazines and our journals be more professional? In general, forget about the relevance debate. Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's sometimes appalling, and it's a poor testament to our field. So, but let's put that aside for a second.
Particularly for practice. The academic stuff, the fact that MISQ might, although it's updating, it doesn't look particular. No one cares, right? But MISQ Executive should be sweet looking. You should be able to, if you're a practitioner, you should be able to forward that around, right?
Well, they've done a few things. I mean, MISQE, they did I think they had a one slide summary, and they had a 4-slide slide deck, some other formats that they made you also create when your article got accepted, to have some formats that would be more translatable to practitioners. But I think this shows the flaw in the argument. You said, look, we have CAIS and we have MISQ Executive. These are the most relevant journals that we have. No, they're not. What you and many others, what they think is, hey, CIS doesn't have the same expectations for novel theoretical contributions. Hence, it must be for practitioners. Well, no, it's not. It's for us. It's our journal. It just has a slightly different feel. It says nothing in there that they even try to be relevant or something like this. Yeah, it's just this common thing. If it's not the same theoretical contribution standard, well, then it must be practice, and that must mean that practitioners read it. I don't think that any single person would go online, Google, and find a CIS paper. And I have no problem with that either. This is not the format for translating and talking with practitioners. You want to talk to practitioners? Go and talk to practitioners.
Dude, Hugh Watson has a tutorial in CAIS, and I don't know if you were editor-in-chief yet, but it's tutorial, business intelligence, past, present, and future. Okay. You're telling me a practitioner wouldn't look at that. Hugh Watson, I used to work with Hugh. So I think of CAIS as all of Hugh's papers in CAIS, which is where he put a big bunch of his practitioner articles. He had another tutorial, big data analytics, a few years later, concepts, technologies, and applications.
These are well-cited tutorials. I know.
Recent developments in data warehousing. You're telling me practitioners don't pick these papers up and look at them?
Well, I say No, I don't think. Well, they may through some Google search, but it won't be on their radar screen. Number one. Number two, they're behind an academic paywall. If you want to read them, you first have to be an AIS member or something like that, right? So you want to talk to practitioners, go to LinkedIn, write a post, end of story. Yeah. So yeah, his papers, his tutorials are great, and they're the most cited papers in CIS, I think, historically. But the reason is that we like them because we like shiny new concepts, and he's really good at writing a tutorial paper that explains his concept to us. So I would go, has some practitioner read it? Of course, someone has, but the bulk is not. Yeah. So I think that's the wrong question to ask.
Yeah, sorry, just one comment. So yeah, I agree with Jan. I guess the days where someone sits at home, gets a journal and goes page by page, is this relevant, are gone. I think practitioners go Google and they find whatever they find. And I think there's a reason why. I think for all three of us, some of the most cited papers are in journals that are not A journals. I think what we need to improve is extracting the artifact. So sometimes when we present to practitioners and said, well, what's the artifact? What can I use? And I think extracting the artifact and making this artifact available to practitioners or to the scientist who takes step two towards impact, that is essential. And one idea, and Jan, we talked about this a few years ago, was also that these artifacts, they need to be beautiful, they need to be easy to consume, they need to be easy on the eye. And why we often talk about they're valid and reliable. There's sort of the ease of consumption. There's a reason why there's a 7S model and not a 2S, 5R, and 2Q model. And so sometimes in our work we said, if it doesn't compromise your results, add beauty to the artifact. And it's a little trick, but that allows you to get one step closer in your terminology and in your uniqueness, and it makes it just easier to remember than staying too close to your.
But who does that, and where's the incentive? If I had a 7S model now that I created, and I had whatever two S's and a P and whatever instead of 7S's, why would I? Where's my incentive to create a 7S model instead of two S's? A P
I'm not sure
what
you experience. So we talked a lot about extrinsic motivation here. Like I have to. I need to publish in the A-star in order to get tenure promoted. I need X amount of A-star papers. When we look for a postdoc, most of them don't rock up and say, that's my A-star journal agenda, and how do I get there? Many of them want to create impact. In addition, and if all I give you as a junior researcher is access to becoming an author of these papers, that might not be good enough in the future for talent attraction. So I hope impact is also an intrinsic motivation. And I hope that you said, I want to create a 7S model because I also want that it's taken up in practice. Yeah. And if you go to bed and say, hey, guess what? This model is used in practice. That's highly rewarding. If you get rich or not is a different conversation. But I believe, at least in the younger generation, they're looking for impact as a source of satisfaction.
Well, not only that, I think it's also a mechanism for differentiation. Yeah, I think we talked in Australia. We talked about this a little bit as well. It's sort of like, what is our playing field? Do you want to compete with Harvard, or do we want to compete with NYU's and whatever else? We can't compete on the A-star level. We don't have the same ecosystem, But we always laughed about American scholars who had 20 great papers in a total of 70 citations. So they did great work and no one has ever read it. Yeah, that was sort of our thing. So anyway, so where I'm going with this is sort of, well, it could also be the thing that differentiates you from a growing number of other IS academics. If I look around me, like what I see in Germany at the moment, now it didn't used to be the case. None of them had a paper in MIS Quarterly. Now Germans, everyone has papers in MIS Quarterly. So what used to be your differentiator, sort of like, oh, I want to get a professor because I'm publishing there. Well, now everybody else does too. So how are you different? Again, tell me. It can't be on papers anymore. Citations, doesn't seem to be the criterion at all. But so maybe it's relevance. Yeah. So maybe you're the guy that is meeting the acceptable or the accepted academic standards, plus you're relevant. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
Yeah, I like what Michael said too, is the intrinsic. So that's going back to the extrinsic, right? That you're just differentiating yourself and all that. And that's true. I think that people have a little more gravitas. Also, your research gets better if you keep a foot in practice and all of that. So I think that, but I really like what you said, Michael, which is, especially young people, they want to change the world. My generation, at least here in the US, is comfortable with, say, market-based capitalism, for example, right?
Yeah.
We all just figure that's the angle. And it's a lot of these younger people. And when I was in college, no one was questioning that. And now some of these younger people are, right? And they're focused on sustainability, and they're focused on diversity, equity, inclusion in ways that we weren't, right? So they're asking, we were of course concerned with a lot of these things, and I would argue we ushered in our generation the era of a lot of these things, certainly sustainability, but we didn't ask these questions in the same way. It wasn't like what we thought about when we woke up in the morning, where I think some of these young people are. And if you're one of those young people that want to change the world, yeah, you're not going to do it by chasing what, as you say, A-star journal publications. But there's no but the other argument is you want to chase enough of the A-star journal publications so that you're at a good school where you can have the legitimacy to maybe affect real change in the world, right? And if you're in Europe and you're a German professor, like Wolf Ketter there at Cologne, your old place, right? He's really concerned about sustainability. He's gotten to the point where I believe he's involved in, German.
He is. I mean, he's my poster. Exactly. He's my poster child at the moment. He's at the World Economic Forum in Davos, informing the world politician and business leaders about how to create more sustainable energy markets. There you go. Yeah. Most of his time, we talked about time before. Most of his times he actually spends in policymaking. Like literally with the decision makers themselves directly.
And that's what I mean. This is highly rewarding. I think you talked once about why we love our job. And I think this is one source of job satisfaction, to whether it's Davos or in front of a board of CEOs, wherever, that's one additional source that often in our kind of extrinsically motivated KPIs is not listed, but for a lot of individuals, tremendously important. And if they have a chance to benefit from this, I think good on them.
But Michael, you also got to say, because relevance as a metric, has sort of crept in, at least in the Australian system. Germany is not. In the UK, I see a lot of sort of social media and blogs about the UK system. It also creates a lot of apprehension for scholars because they feel like, oh my God, they're imposing yet another set of metrics. Yet another thing I need to do. And I think also the reality is for some of our friends, for example, or even, well, they want to be the great scholars and they want to figure out that angels on the pen problem, and I say, well, let them do that. My issue is more that we don't have an equal playing field for those that are intrinsically motivated to be relevant and do this and put the time and effort there. They don't have the same level playing field, because it's not, the incentive system doesn't quite reward it in the same way. But I'd say, well, leave the philosophers and let them be philosophical and let the relevant people be relevant. Not everything has to be everything all the time. And Nick's paper, while it may be relevant, doesn't need to have a practical implication section.
Yeah. People change for two reasons. They have to or they want to. And as long as the narrative is around, you have to do this, it's hard. So for me, also as a leader of a team, I try to have a lot of want-to conversations. And being relevant means I might see a problem before others, and I have a first mover advantage because I'm closer to industry. Industry might pay for what I'm doing. So I can scale up, might have a research assistant, a PhD scholarship. So I can have a bigger bandwidth. As you know, Jan, you did it yourself. You get access to empirical evidence. That is of higher quality, and you have real business analysts and not substitutes called students as a source of empirical evidence. So relevance comes with multiple advantages, and I think we need to articulate them so that more and more researchers say, I want to be relevant, or not I have to be relevant.
And can I actually make a point about this? So I love this idea of intrinsic and also what the incentives are. And this is what I think, as you said, Recker, it's a hygiene factor now, even in Germany and wherever, to have your MIS quarterly and I think in the US, actually, this is where I know that outside of the US, we have this reputation for just being a journal counting, top tier journals. We have a machine and that's all anybody focuses on in the business schools. And as an insider that just got promoted, right, recently to full professor, right? I think the bar for getting tenure and the bar for becoming a full professor is starting to shift. And I'm sensing this, not just at my university. My university is weird because we have a mission to change the world, right? So there's always the question is what this person doing in any way impacting the world? That's just not just Notre Dame, though. We see it happening at a lot of top tier schools. We find that maybe it's not the top tier schools that are journal counting anymore. There are people at absolute elite schools that have the right count that are not getting tenure, that have actually a huge number that don't get tenure, and some who have far fewer are getting tenure. So I think what's happening is instead of more is better, there's this idea of threshold effects. If you have a few, you've shown that you can write an MISQ or an org sci or a AMJ or a management science, right? So once you have, say, 3, 4, 5, 6, right, for that tenure space, depending on which school you're talking about, any more than that doesn't actually get you tenure better, right? The issue is, what else are they doing, right? What are they actually researching? How is what they're researching positioned to, and then when you become full professor, so it's not just getting tenure, but full professor. And I noticed this with my package, but I see this happening more and more with people we recruited, people we see elsewhere. It's not counting. If someone has, say, if a full professor has, say, a dozen top tier publications, or if they have 30 top tier publications,
it doesn't matter.
No one distinguishes between the two. No one says, oh, but this one has 30, that one has 12. Therefore, this is the more desirable full professor. Yeah. We hired Ahmed Abbasi as our chaired professor in business analytics a couple of years ago. And he's a rock star, right? But there were people applying for the job who had much better records than, not better, but much more in terms of numbers than he did. But he was our first choice. And we went for him. We wanted him. And it wasn't the numbers. He had enough, and it no longer mattered. It had to do with what he was working on, the impacts, the closeness with industry, right? So I think, yeah, it's a hygiene factor, but it's now to the point, I think, at least in the US, where when you have enough, now you're good. Now it's the other stuff that matters if you actually went. And I think we're going back in that direction because people have figured out the game in order to, if you really want 5 top tier A journal hits, you'll get 5 top tier A journal hits, right? Assuming you have the desire, the ecosystem, and the training, right? And it still takes a lot to do that, but that's not enough, right? It's you check that box, but you need more to go over.
Yeah. I like what you're saying, Nick. I just hope it's not a sequential process where we say, be rigorous, get your 5 A stars, and then do what you want and be relevant.
Yeah, no.
If we could find a way that yes, you got the A star because you're so incredibly relevant. You saw the problem early on. Your empirical evidence was mind blowing, and this is why we reward you with an A star.
Yeah, but you can't get 5 A stars. Teach your body that movement, right? That train yourself like an athlete to do that, and then shift and do a different movement. Right? You have to be able to do both at the same time, or have a deep understanding of both.
Exactly, and then from young years on, absolutely. And then so it's just, I've been at events where young or mid-career researchers said, well, yes, once I'm tenured, then I can be relevant. And I think we need to have that sort of attitude that I want to be engaged, and an engaged scholar mingles with practice. It doesn't say I need a case study and then on request I'm going out and find data. You want to be in that crowd of professionals, and you want to sense the next challenge or research opportunity in the making early on. But we don't talk about this sort of first mover advantage in our community. We see the final outcome, the paper. We don't see when you started running.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, I don't want to open up a whole new topic here, but I think in this first mover advantage, in starting it off, I think there's a lot of little mistakes that people make. So you mentioned a little bit asking the right question. So what I see a lot is where we say, look, we want to work with this company. This is a big name company. In Germany, we started to work with this company who's really the German example for digital innovation. Really cool, innovative stuff in this industrial age country that I'm in here. And of course, we go there and we have a hypothesis. We have a research question of our own. But they're not interested in that. But they're interested in other things. They want to work with us, but not on this question. And I see a lot of people again. It's like, oh, you don't want to work on this question. I'm sorry, I don't want to work with you then. And I said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to get an answer to the question that you hypothetically derived in your mind, and then find the one case study that allows you this, or do you want to work with them? Because they're cool and they have cool problems. And I think these are cool problems, relevant problems that are also theoretically interesting, but it's just not what we thought, So are you willing to shift gears and change your own thought about what it is that we're going to be doing in order to be relevant and work with them? So I think for us, many of us still think my case study is data. This is my place of data collection, which means I go in, I want to ask my interview questions, and I'm going to do this. And when I'm done with this, why would I go back? I have what I wanted. I have my 30 interviews or something. And, why would I go back and tell them what I found?
Yeah. With my dissertation, right? Youngjin, you and I were embedded in NASA, and we wrote a few papers afterwards on the stuff. And what I think is really funny is what you're saying. We wrote reports to NASA. We did things with NASA. We had meetings and presentations, none of which got published. None of our ideas, and it impacted their efforts, their one NASA program that they had. That's what we were studying, and we impacted the way they were doing some things. So it was kind of cool. None of that ever made it into a journal. None of that ever made it outside of NASA, right? However, then we had, over 100 interviews, and we had all this stuff, and we were able to publish a handful of papers from it over the course of a decade, right? So I think it's this idea of you have to have both legs out there. And I think you did the same thing with Woolworth, and the questions they're asking are not necessarily the same questions you're going to publish, or maybe they're inspiring what you're going to publish, or maybe but it's not the same thing. It's not like I'm going to publish this and then give it to them and everything will be good, right? Although we did work with a large tech company just last year, right? We got a bunch of data from them and their help desks. And we did some kind of econometric analysis. It's a paper we have out in Journal of Operations Management, right? And we gave it back to the company, and they were surprised at the findings. So sometimes, and we analyzed their help desk. We looked at this idea of inertia, and we said that people have inertia in routing their calls, right? So we gave it back to the company, and that was a surprise to them. They're like, "Oh, this is interesting," and I don't know if it's impacting policy or something. But I guess sometimes you can affect the actual activity. So.
I think we need some etiquette, sort of the closing the loop at the end of a case study. That just should be proper practice, because that also makes it for your successor, the second person dealing with this organization, easier, because they're used to the standards, to the professional standards of our discipline. I'd just like to park one last idea. So we're interested in trust at the moment, and now you could go to a certain company and work out what's their related challenge. We crafted a trust alliance. So once a month, 4:30 to 6:30 in the evening at our university, and we throw in wine and cheese, we get 30 professionals. It's a community of practitioners, and we've got just 5-6 people in that crowd. Yeah. And our people just present ideas, we listen carefully. And if someone says, I'm in cryptocurrency and I want to build trust in crypto, we would say, hey, never thought about it, but maybe that's of interest. So to control the boundaries of the people that you're working with and say, well, that's a sort of broad area that I'm interested in, open up the floodgate, have regular conversations, and every now and again, they listen and will be inspired, or you listen and will be inspired. And these are just the sort of little efforts we are requiring to be truly engaged practitioners. And engaged really means, if not on a daily, on a weekly basis, being out there and interact.
Yeah, I agree. I think have one foot in the world is something we should all aspire to, and have that domain where you actually understand what's going on in practice. Maybe each of your papers doesn't have to be practically relevant, but your foot in that domain.
And after all, we are not in philosophy, and we are not in theoretical computer science or theoretical social science either. We are in information systems. So if you wanted to study the big, deep philosophical question and solve that problem with the angels, well, maybe you should have picked a different field then. I mean, there's this argument to be made as well, right? It is information systems, is how businesses or people deal with technology. I always say, like, how the hell am I going to find that out if I sit in my office all day? Can't find it out. The problem is not here. and I can't find it here either. I got to go out and then talk to these companies and see what they're doing, because I think, to me, this is where the problem lies, right? And if I wanted to start something formal and theoretical, well, I should have done math instead. Then I can sit at home and think about that all the time.
Yep. Yeah. On the other hand, you mentioned, Recker, in a previous podcast that Freakonomics was the book that really inspired you. And if you think about it, what did Freakonomics, what did those guys do? They took an economic method and applied it to a whole bunch of things
practically relevant questions. So sort of things that people talked about, right? So the sort of the how New York City handled its crime rates. Why, we knew about this in Europe and we knew about this in Australia. It was a big topic. The world knew about it, right? So that's a problem that was relevant, or at least interesting to lots of folks, not just to a bunch of sociologists in New York or Columbia.
But on this one, we talk about relevance. I'm not sure if you follow the Freakonomics podcast, but they really went back to the old data and asked, is it still true that the legalization of abortion led to a drop in crime rate?
And
that's what I mean with relevance. Yeah. So it's not just a moment in time. A relevant, engaged researcher would continue to ask the question, is my research still relevant? Is it still valid? And it's interesting when they talked about what they've done, the technical mistake they made in the paper, and how they got criticized for lack of rigor. And they all did this years and years after their first study. So I think relevance means also continuous relevance over time, and not just be satisfied with a one-off impact.
Yeah, agreed.
Good point.
Well, that's wonderful, Michael. It was an absolute pleasure having you on. I know when you ask Recker, either on the air or off the air, who he just is thrilled that he had the opportunity to work with and admires immensely. He always mentions you as one of his role models. So I think it was wonderful having you on board.
Absolutely.
Now, the admiration is mutual, and you do great work. Continue your great work, and thank you so much for creating a very enjoyable hour in my life.
Wow. We created an enjoyable hour.
No one has ever said that to us.
That's beautiful.
All right, guys. All right. Thanks for taking the time.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye. Take care.